Hi, I'm Sam. I was there, trapped thousands of feet below the Atlantic, when our new chief engineer told the captain to prepare for the end. He said our sinking submarine was a lost cause, that the engines were dead for good. Then I watched him laugh, actually laugh, when a 10-year-old boy whispered that he knew how to fix it. Little did that arrogant officer know, all 130 of our lives depended on that grieving child. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you held the one answer that mattered? Before I tell you how that boy Leo used nothing but his father's memory to bring our nuclear reactor's heart back to life, comment where you're watching from and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the look on Lieutenant Commander Thorne's face when the whole sub started to hum again. The whole thing started with a sound no submariner ever wants to hear. It wasn't an explosion, but a deep, gut-wrenching groan of tortured metal, like the world's biggest bone was snapping in. Slow motion. We'd hit an uncharted seamount. The boat lurched violently, throwing men against consoles and bulkheads. The lights flickered and died, replaced instantly by the hellish red glow of the emergency lighting. Alarms blared, a chaotic symphony of failure. In that first moment, training takes over. You check your station, report damage, but beneath the practiced procedure, a cold, primal fear begins to creep in. We were deep, deeper than we should have been to sustain this kind of hit. We were a steel coffin, and the ocean was starting to knock on the lid, reminding us it was there. The immediate crisis wasn't the hull breach. That was a slow, weeping leak we could manage for a while. The real death sentence came from the engine room. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, our new chief engineer, reported it with a clipped, almost sterile voice. The primary coolant pumps for the secondary loop were offline. No pumps, no steam, no steam, no turbines. No turbines meant no propulsion, and soon no power. We were dead in the water, a silent, powerless hulk sinking under its own weight. Thorne was a man who trusted manuals and diagnostics over anything else. He and his team swarmed the engine room, their faces illuminated by flashlights and monitor screens, but the silence from the heart of the boat was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Hours bled into one another in that red-lit gloom. The initial adrenaline gave way to a thick, suffocating despair. You could taste it in the recycled air, heavy with the smell of hot circuits and sweat. The crew, all seasoned sailors, moved with a grim, practiced resignation. They secured their stations, wrote letters they knew would never be sent, and shared silent, knowing looks. Captain Miller stood on the bridge, his face a stone mask, but his eyes held the weight of 130 souls. The groans of the hull under the mounting pressure became our new clock, each creak and pop a tick closer to our crushed depth. Hope wasn't just fading. It had been officially declared dead by the engineering department. We were just waiting for the inevitable final collapse. And amidst all this, there was Leo, the boy. He was just 10 years old, the son of our former chief engineer, a man we'd lost in an accident on this very sub just weeks before. Captain Miller, his father's best friend, was bringing him to a naval base for the funeral. Now the boy was trapped in his father's tomb with us. He didn't cry or panic. He just sat on a tool chest in a corridor, his small frame almost swallowed by the shadows, fiddling with a loose bolt he'd found. To us, he was a tragic footnote, a painful reminder of our friend. Most of the crew avoided looking at him, a mixture of pity and the awkwardness of not knowing what to say. He was a ghost before we all became ghosts. The final nail in the coffin came when Thorne emerged from the engine room, his face pale and streaked with grease. He walked straight to Captain Miller, his posture stiff with the kind of pride that can't admit defeat, only state facts. Sir, I've run every diagnostic 3 times. We've bypassed every relay and checked every circuit. The pump motors are irrevocably offline. There is a catastrophic failure in the windings that we cannot repair. He said it loud enough for the whole control room to hear. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. He was the expert, the man with the credentials and the manuals, and he had just signed our death warrant. The silence that followed his words was heavier than all the water above us. It was the sound of the end. That was when the boy Leo, who had been a silent shadow in the corridor, took a hesitant step into the control room. The red emergency lights caught the side of his face, making him look even smaller and more fragile against the grim-faced men. In the crushing silence left by Thorne's verdict, Leo's voice was shockingly clear, though barely a whisper. "It's not broken. He wasn't looking at the captain or the engineer. His eyes were fixed on the dormant console panels, as if he could see something the rest of us couldn't. For a split second, nobody moved. It was like a bird had chirped in the middle of a funeral. The sound was so out of place, so fundamentally wrong for the moment, that our brains couldn't quite process it. It was a tiny spark of defiance in a room that had already surrendered. Lieutenant Commander Thorne was the first to snap out of the trance. He turned, his expression a mixture of irritation and disbelief when he saw the source of the voice. A short, derisive laugh escaped his lips, a truly ugly sound in that tense space. "Captain," he said, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed Miller but looked down at Leo. "With all due respect, this is a highly sensitive situation. Can we please get the child out of the control room? This isn't a place for make-believe." The insult was so sharp, so dismissive, it felt like a physical blow. He didn't just ignore Leo. He publicly branded him as an irrelevant, foolish distraction. I felt a hot flash of anger rise in my chest. Thorne wasn't just wrong. He was cruel, using his rank to humiliate a grieving kid. Captain Miller looked exhausted, his face a roadmap of impossible choices. You could see the conflict in his eyes. On one side was his duty to his friend's son, on the other was the rigid chain of command and the cold, hard facts presented by his expert engineer. But Leo was undeterred. He shuffled forward, his worn sneakers silent on the steel deck, and walked right up to the main engineering console. He reached out a small, grimy hand and pointed not at the main screen, but at a small, dusty pressure gauge on a lower panel, a dial most of us hadn't looked at in years. "It's thirsty," he repeated, his voice a little stronger this time. "Dad said that's the pump's telltale heart. It's supposed to hum. It's whispering instead." He was speaking a different language, a language of metaphor his father had taught him, and to Thorne it was pure gibberish. Thorne's thin veneer of professionalism finally cracked. He stepped forward, planting himself between Leo and the console, a wall of starched white uniform and indignant pride. "Son," he began, his voice dangerously low, "I'm sure your father was a fine engineer, but he filled your head with poetry. This is a billion-dollar nuclear vessel, not a storybook. We operate on the principles of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics, not on whether an engine is thirsty or whispering. Now you will be silent." He used the memory of Leo's own father as a weapon, twisting the man's love into a mark of foolishness. I watched Leo's face. He didn't flinch or cry. He just looked past Thorne, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if the engineer was nothing more than a loud, frustrating obstacle to the real problem. Finally, Captain Miller moved. He walked over and placed a heavy, gentle hand on Leo's small shoulder. "Leo, that's enough," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Mr. Thorne and his men have done everything they can. We appreciate you wanting to help. But this is for the crew to handle now. Petty Officer Davies will take you back to your bunk." The captain was trying to be kind, to shield the boy from Thorne's escalating anger, but it felt like the ultimate betrayal. He was choosing the certainty of failure over the slimmest chance of a different outcome. Leo looked up at the captain, and for the first time, you could see the profound disappointment in his eyes. This was his father's best friend, the man he trusted, and he was giving up, just like all the others. Petty Officer Davies, a young sailor with kind eyes, approached and gently took Leo's arm. "Come on, kid, let's get you out of here." But Leo pulled his arm away with surprising strength. He didn't raise his voice or throw a tantrum. He simply stood his ground and, with a chilling sort of calm, looked from Thorne to the captain. "Now you're listening to the wrong things," he stated, not as a plea but as a fact. "Dad said the diagnostics lie sometimes. He said you have to listen with your hands, feel the vibration in the plates." Before anyone could react, he turned and darted out of the control room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, not towards his quarters, but towards the sealed-off engineering section. Thorne just shook his head. "The boy is in shock, Captain. It's a textbook trauma response." The captain let out a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the weight of all 130 souls on board. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Thorne. The message was clear. Proceed with the end. The brief, impossible interruption was over. The adults were back in control, steering the ship towards its final, logical destination at the bottom of the sea. The injustice of it all was suffocating. We were going to die, not because there was no hope, but because the one person who offered it was too small, too young, and too different to be heard. The arrogance of one man, backed by the weary resignation of another, had just slammed the door on our only chance, and all we could do was watch them lock it and throw away the key. A tense, almost sacred silence fell over the control room. The captain's order to take Leo away had been the final punctuation mark on our fate. Thorne, ever the professional, returned to his console, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He had won the argument. Procedure had triumphed over a child's fantasy. The crew resumed their silent final duties, their movements slow and deliberate, like monks performing a rite for the dead. The red light seemed to pulse with the groaning of the hull, a monstrous heartbeat counting down our last minutes. Every man in that room, myself included, was thinking the same thing. We were going to die because we had followed the rules. We had listened to the expert, and the expert had told us to give up. The brief, insane spark of hope Leo had ignited was gone, stomped out by rank and reason. I couldn't shake the image of the boy's face as he was dismissed. It wasn't the look of a child who was wrong. It was the look of someone who couldn't understand why the adults were being so stupid. I felt a hot, useless anger churning in my gut. I looked at Thorne, who was now calmly briefing his second-in-command on the shutdown sequence as if he were discussing a training exercise. His arrogance was a physical presence in the room, more suffocating than the recycled air. He hadn't just been dismissive, he'd been cruel, using a boy's grief as a punchline. I glanced at Captain Miller, who stood staring at the depth gauge, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had just been forced to execute his own family. The injustice of it all was a bitter pill to swallow. We weren't dying to an enemy torpedo or a catastrophic failure, but to pride. The captain finally turned from the gauges and walked slowly to the communication station. He picked up the wideband microphone, the one used for broadcasting to Fleet Command. This was it, the final message. The official declaration that the USS Patriot was lost with all hands. I saw his thumb hover over the transmit button, his knuckles white. The entire control room held its breath. You could feel the history in that moment, the weight of every lost submarine, every sailor who had ever sent a last goodbye from the deep. He was about to condemn 130 men and one small boy to a silent, crushing end. He was about to tell the world that we had failed, that we had given up. His eyes were closed, and I knew he was seeing his friend, Leo's father, and apologizing for failing his son. Just as he was about to press the button, a frantic, panicked voice erupted from the internal comm speaker, shattering the silence. "Control engine room! Control engine room, respond!" It was a young petty officer, his voice cracking with alarm. "Sir, we have an unauthorized entry. The secondary access hatch to the pump housing. Someone's overridden the manual lock. It's the boy, sir. It's Leo. He's inside the containment area." A collective shock went through the room. The containment area around the primary coolant pumps was one of the most restricted and dangerous parts of the ship. For a moment, nobody moved. The idea was so preposterous, so outside the realm of possibility, that it didn't compute. The sinking of the submarine was suddenly a secondary problem. Thorne spun around, his face turning a shade of crimson I'd never seen before. The professional mask was gone, replaced by pure, undiluted fury. "What do you mean he's inside?" he roared into the comms. "That area is sealed. Get him out of there now. That's a direct violation of safety protocol." He was shouting about rules and regulations, but his panic was transparent. It wasn't just about safety. This was the ultimate act of defiance. The child he had dismissed as a traumatized storyteller had not only ignored him, but had physically broken into his domain, the very heart of the machinery he had declared dead. It was a direct challenge to his authority, to his expertise, and he couldn't stand it. He was losing control, and his carefully constructed world of certainties was crumbling around him. A new kind of tension gripped the control room, sharp and electric. The slow, grim march towards death had been violently interrupted. The groaning of the hull was still there, a constant reminder of our primary doom. But now there was a second, more immediate crisis playing out. What was a 10-year-old boy doing in a sealed engineering compartment? How did he even get in? The crew exchanged nervous, uncertain glances. The despair that had settled over us was replaced by a confusing mix of fear and a wild, irrational flicker of something else. It wasn't quite hope, but it was a powerful curiosity. For the first time in hours, something was happening that wasn't in the manual, something unpredictable. The entire focus of the room shifted from the water outside to the small boy inside. Captain Miller stood frozen for a second, his hand still on the microphone. He looked at the comm speaker, then at Thorne's enraged face, then at the empty corridor where Leo had vanished. You could see the gears turning in his head, a desperate calculation being made. He was a man drowning, and someone had just thrown him a stone. It probably wouldn't save him, but it was something to grab onto. With a sudden, decisive movement, he slammed the microphone back into its cradle. The loud clatter made Thorne jump. The captain didn't even look at his chief engineer. He looked straight at me and another senior officer. "You two, with me," he commanded, his voice low and firm. "We're going down there." He wasn't sending a security team. He was going himself. The surrender was over. We moved fast, a strange procession through the dying submarine. Captain Miller led the way, his long strides eating up the narrow corridor. He wasn't running, but he was moving with a furious purpose I'd never seen in him before. I was right on his heels, my heart pounding against my ribs, and behind me I could hear the heavy, angry footsteps of Lieutenant Commander Thorne. He was muttering under his breath, a stream of regulations and protocols being violated. The few crewmen we passed flattened themselves against the bulkheads, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and confusion. They were witnessing the complete breakdown of the chain of command, a captain leading a desperate charge into the heart of the ship, chasing a ghost and following a child. The groans of the hull were getting louder, more frequent, a constant reminder that this mad dash was our last desperate play. We reached the heavy circular hatch leading to the secondary pump compartment. A young sailor, the one who had made the frantic call, stood there looking pale and terrified. "Sir, I don't know how he did it," the sailor stammered, pointing at the hatch's locking mechanism. "The manual override wheel. It takes 2 men to turn it. I swear, I looked away for a second and heard it moving. When I turned back, the indicator was green. He was already inside." Thorne pushed past me, his flashlight beam landing on the thick steel wheel. He ran a hand over it, his expression hardening with disbelief. "That's impossible," he spat. "That lock is a purely mechanical system. A 10-year-old boy does not have the physical strength." The captain didn't say a word. He just grabbed the latch and heaved the heavy door open. The air that billowed out felt ancient and hot, thick with the smell of lubricant and something else, a metallic, electric tang of ozone. It was the smell of a machine that had been holding its breath for too long. The space beyond the hatch was a cramped, dark maze of pipes, conduits, and looming machinery, a place where only engineers were meant to go. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, dancing across steel plates and pressure gauges that hadn't been seen by human eyes in years. Then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the random creaking of the sub. It was deliberate, methodical. It was coming from deeper inside, from the very heart of the compartment where the dead pump was housed. Captain Miller didn't hesitate. He plunged into the darkness, following the sound. We found him on a narrow metal catwalk, overlooking the colossal, silent pump housing. Leo was perched there, cross-legged, looking like a tiny gargoyle in the vast, dark space. He had a small, forgotten wrench in his hand, and he was methodically tapping it against a large intake pipe, his head cocked to the side as if listening to the echo. He looked up as our lights found him, his eyes calm and focused, not like a scared child, but like a doctor examining a patient. "I told you," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the metal. "Chamber. It's thirsty. There's an air bubble stuck in its throat. The computer can't see it, so it thinks the pump is broken." He pointed with the wrench not at the electronic controls, but at a series of large, dust-covered manual valve wheels bolted to the bulkhead. This was the final straw for Thorne. His face, illuminated by the bobbing flashlight beams, was a mask of pure fury. "This has gone far enough, Captain," he yelled, his voice echoing louder than Leo's. "This is a restricted, high radiation risk area. He is playing with a wrench next to a primary coolant system. He is going to get us all killed. I am ordering this compartment evacuated and sealed per Naval Regulation 7.14. He took a step towards Leo, his hand outstretched as if to physically drag him off the catwalk. He wasn't just angry. He was terrified. This was a world he didn't understand, a problem that wasn't in his books, and it was breaking him. He was a man of numbers and procedures, and he was faced with something that felt like magic. Captain Miller moved so fast it shocked us both. He put himself directly between Thorne and the boy, his body a solid wall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Stand down, Commander," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You've had your chance. Your regulations and your diagnostics have gotten us nothing but a death sentence." The ship chose that exact moment to let out a deep, agonizing groan, a shudder that vibrated up through the soles of our boots. It was a perfect, terrible punctuation mark. The captain turned his back on his fuming chief engineer and looked up at the small boy on the catwalk. He looked from Thorne's red, contorted face to Leo's serene, certain one. In that moment, he made his choice. He was throwing the rulebook into the abyss. "Show me, Leo," the captain said, his voice soft now, filled with a desperate, paternal exhaustion. "Show me what your father taught you." The question hung in the hot, metallic air, a complete surrender of rank and reason to a child's intuition. Leo didn't seem to notice the gravity of the moment. He was just focused on the problem. He pointed the wrench to one specific large valve wheel, painted a faded red and covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked like it hadn't been turned since the sub was first built. "That's the breather," Leo said simply. "Dad said the digital sensors can get vapor-locked. They can't tell the difference between no water and an air bubble. He said you have to let it breathe before it can drink. You just have to open it for a second." Thorne stared at the dusty red wheel as if it were an ancient curse. You could see the war playing out on his face. His entire career, his training, every manual he'd ever memorized, screamed that this was insane. This was voodoo, not engineering. But the captain's order, spoken with the quiet finality of a man with nothing left to lose, was absolute. Thorne's jaw was so tight I thought his teeth would crack. He turned to the young petty officer who had been standing guard, his voice a choked, strangled thing. "You heard the captain," he bit out, not looking at Leo or Miller. "Turn the valve. Quarter turn, counterclockwise, slowly." The order was an admission of his own total, humiliating failure, and every man in that compartment, and everyone watching from the control room, knew it. The young sailor, looking terrified to be at the center of this drama, grabbed the wheel with both hands. It was caked in decades of dust and grime, clearly not part of any standard procedure. He put his shoulder into it, his muscles straining, his boots scraping on the metal deck. The wheel didn't budge, it was frozen solid. The sailor grunted, repositioning his grip, and tried again. A low groan of protest came from the valve, but it wasn't the sound of the ship dying. It was the sound of old metal fighting against a new command. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. I saw Thorne's lip curl into a sneer, a flicker of vindication in his eyes. He was ready to say, "I told you so," ready to reclaim his authority. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sailor's strained breathing. Then it happened. Not a grand explosion, but a sharp, violent hiss that cut through the tension like a knife. It was the sound of a giant lung exhaling after being held for an eternity. A plume of dust and vapor erupted from the valve stem, and the sailor stumbled back, startled. The hissing was loud, almost a shriek, the sound of a massive pressure imbalance being corrected. It was the sound of the air bubble, the very thing Leo had talked about, being violently purged from the system. On the comms, I could hear someone in the engine room gasp. Thorne's face went slack with shock, his mouth slightly agape. He stared at the valve, then at Leo, then back at the valve. The poetry his father had taught him had just become the hardest, most undeniable fact in our world. The hiss was immediately, followed by a sound that was even more shocking, a deep, powerful gurgle. It was the sound of water, thousands of gallons of it, surging into the empty intake pipe, filling the void left by the escaping air. The massive pipe shuddered, the vibrations running through the entire compartment. Back in the control room, our heads snapped toward the engineering console. The primary coolant pressure gauge, the one that had been flatlined at 0 for hours, suddenly twitched. Then, with a decisive leap, the needle jumped from the red and shot straight into the middle of the green. A collective, audible gasp went through the control room. It wasn't a computer glitch. It wasn't a sensor error. It was real. The pump was no longer thirsty. It was drinking. Down in the engine room, Thorne stood mesmerized, his flashlight beam fixed on the now living gauges on the pump housing. The arrogance had been completely stripped from him, replaced by a raw, naked awe. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a resurrection. He turned slowly, his movements robotic, and faced the main pump control panel. His hand, the hand of a man who prided himself on his steady precision, was visibly trembling as he reached for the main activation switch. He hesitated for a single, profound second, his gaze flickering one last time to the small, silent boy on the catwalk. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to carry the weight of all our lives, he flipped the switch. For a moment, there was only the click of the relay. Then a low hum began, a deep, resonant thrum that started in the engine room and spread through the entire submarine. It was a vibration we felt in our bones, in our teeth. The hum grew steadily, not with the strained scream of a failing machine, but with the confident rising power of a healthy heart. It swelled into a powerful rhythmic roar, the beautiful, life-giving song of a nuclear submarine's engine coming back online. The sound completely drowned out the groaning, death rattles of the hull. It was the sound of hope. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of a 10-year-old boy who had listened to his father. The USS Patriot was alive again. An absolute, stunned silence fell over the control room, a silence made even more profound by the powerful hum now vibrating through the deck. The crew just stared at the glowing green lights on the console, their faces a canvas of disbelief, relief, and something akin to religious awe. Men looked at each other, their eyes wide, as if to confirm that they weren't all sharing the same hallucination. Captain Miller didn't look at the console. He didn't look at Thorne. He turned his back on all of it and looked straight at the monitor showing the feed from the engine room. His eyes were locked on Leo. There was no victory in the captain's face, no triumph. There was only a deep, profound, and humbling gratitude. He wasn't looking at a child anymore. He was looking at the living memory of his best friend, the boy who had saved them all by speaking a language no one else remembered. The journey back to the surface was the quietest I've ever experienced on a submarine. The powerful, steady hum of the engines was a constant living presence, a reminder of just how close we had come to eternal silence. The crew moved with a new kind of purpose, their actions no longer just trained reflexes, but imbued with a profound sense of gratitude. No one spoke of what happened in the engine room, not in any official capacity. It became a piece of sacred history, a story that belonged only to the 130 men who had lived it. The red emergency lights were gone, replaced by the normal, sterile white light of the ship, but everything felt different. We had been to the bottom of the ocean and had been brought back not by technology or procedure, but by a boy's memory. Leo was no longer a ghost in the corridors. He became the quiet, revered soul of the USS Patriot. The men who had avoided his gaze now sought it out, not with pity, but with a deep, wordless respect. The cook always made sure he had the first and warmest cookie from a fresh batch. A grizzled old sonar tech, a man I'd never seen smile, silently handed him a small, beautifully carved wooden whale he'd been whittling for years. Leo didn't become loud or boisterous. He remained the same quiet, observant boy, but he was no longer alone. He would sit in the mess hall, and there would always be a sailor sitting nearby, just quietly, keeping watch. He wasn't a mascot. He was one of us. He was the keeper of our miracle. Captain Miller was a master of naval bureaucracy. In the official log, the incident was recorded with clinical precision. It read, "Catastrophic engine failure due to an anomalous vapor lock in the primary coolant intake. Situation rectified via application of a legacy manual bleed procedure, outlined in decommissioned schematics." There was no mention of a boy, no mention of a thirsty engine or a telltale heart. He protected Thorne. He protected the chain of command, and he protected the Navy from a truth it would never be able to officially process. But every man who signed off on that report knew the truth. We knew that the decommissioned schematic was the memory of a loving father, and the unconventional diagnostic was the faith of his son. A few days later, just before we docked, the captain called a few of us to his private quarters. Leo was there, standing awkwardly in the small, wood-paneled room. Captain Miller didn't say much. He just opened a small velvet-lined box. Inside were the gold dolphins, the chief engineer's insignia, that had belonged to Leo's father. The captain knelt down, his large hands gentle, and pinned them to the collar of Leo's small jacket. "Your father was the best engineer I ever knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He would be so proud of you, Leo. He saved us, through you." In that moment, Leo wasn't just a boy wearing his father's pin. He was the heir to a legacy far greater than anyone could have imagined. The biggest change, however, was in Lieutenant Commander Thorne. The arrogance was gone, sandblasted away by the raw, humbling truth of what had happened. I saw him approach Leo a day before we docked. Leo was sitting alone, fiddling with a piece of wire. Thorne didn't stand over him. He pulled up a crate, sat down so he was at the boy's eye level, and opened a small, empty notebook. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet and completely devoid of condescension, "the telltale heart. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about what your father taught you." It was the most profound apology I have ever witnessed. It wasn't an admission of being wrong. It was a request to be taught, the ultimate surrender of a proud man. When we finally docked, the world outside was just the same as we'd left it, but we were different, all of us. As Leo walked down the gangplank, he wasn't the grieving orphan being delivered to an uncertain future. He was a quiet legend, flanked by Captain Miller on one side and a humble chief engineer on the other, with 127 sailors watching his back. He had found a new, unlikely family within that steel hull, and in doing so, he had found a way to keep his father's spirit alive. In the crushing depths where protocols failed and hope died, we learned that the soul of a machine doesn't always speak in data, but sometimes it just whispers its secrets to a heart that knows how to listen. I think about that day all the time. It's been years, but the memory is as clear as the polished brass on the captain's desk. None of us who were on the Patriot are the same. We went down as sailors and came back as something else. We look at the world differently now. When some high-ranking expert on television or in a boardroom declares something impossible, a quiet, knowing look passes between any of us who happen to be in the same room. We know that the most complex problems sometimes have the simplest answers, and that true expertise doesn't always come with a fancy title or a row of medals on a chest. We learned that the world is full of whispers, and you just have to be humble enough to shut up and listen for them. Leo never joined the Navy. He didn't need to. He grew up to be a quiet man, a brilliant engineer who designed deep-sea exploration vehicles. But he never forgot the language his father taught him. He builds machines that listen. His legacy isn't just in the lives he saved, but in the lesson he burned into our souls. Wisdom isn't always loud. It doesn't live in textbooks or flowcharts. Sometimes it's a quiet intuition passed down from a father to a son, a feeling in your gut, a vibration in a steel plate that tells you something is wrong when all the computers are screaming that everything is fine. He taught us that sometimes the most important knowledge is the kind that can't be measured, only felt. He proved that a heart full of love is a more powerful diagnostic tool than any machine ever built. The change on the Patriot was immediate and permanent. Lieutenant Commander Thorne became the best chief engineer in the fleet, not because he got smarter, but because he learned to be humble. He kept that empty notebook with him always, and I'd often see him just sitting in the engine room, his eyes closed, just listening. He started teaching his new recruits not just to read the manuals, but to get to know the boat, to learn its moods and its groans. Captain Miller retired a few years later, a celebrated hero, but we knew his real victory wasn't surviving. But in that single moment, when he chose to trust a grieving child over his own decorated officer, he chose faith in humanity over the certainty of procedure, and that decision echoed through the rest of his command and the rest of our lives. So why am I telling you this? Because I know what it feels like to be in a room where everyone thinks they have the answers, and you, the quiet one in the corner, are completely invisible. We've all been Leo at some point in our lives, holding a simple truth while the experts laugh or dismiss us because we don't have the right credentials or speak their language. That experience taught me that your voice matters, even if it's just a whisper. Your intuition, your unique way of seeing the world, is not a weakness. It's a superpower. Don't ever let the pride or the arrogance of others convince you to be silent. The world is full of sinking ships, and sometimes the only person who knows how to fix the engine is the one nobody is listening to. If this story reminded you of someone with that quiet strength, that unique way of seeing things that the world needs more of, please share this with them. It might be the sign they need to trust their own voice. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the unrecognized heroes who end up changing everything, often when no one is watching. Thank you for letting me share this piece of my life, for letting me tell you about the boy who taught a boatload of hardened sailors how to listen to a whisper at the bottom of the ocean. Thank you for hearing me.